the perspective view just to make sure that this camera is actually, so the spotlight is actually the right rotation, and we can just scale that up if we need to see it a bit better. There we go, and yes, it does look like it's coming from the same general direction. So this one won't actually cast any light, it would just cast photons on a mental ray, emit photons. Let's go into indirect lighting and turn on caustics, and let's just beef that up quite a lot and see what we get. And we do have the caustics in there. If we quickly just set up a render layer, a render pass as our indirect lighting, we'll be able to see exactly what that looks like. So file, oops, we can't actually get a render pass because we're rendering IFF. Let's just make this OpenEXR 32 bits and re-render. New file, oh, we still can't get a render pass. Why is that? That would be because I have not associated the render pass. Okay, so that's what our caustic looks like. That's looking okay, but what would be better is if it was sharper. So if we just come to our light, this is the amount of photons here. I'm going to add 2 zeros to that. That might be a bit bright. Let's actually do this on a separate render layer just so that we can see the caustics easier. If I copy this layer, call this caustics, and I'll just actually hide the chessboard here, remove that, Control H is to remove or hide it from on this particular render layer. I'm just going to apply Lambert 1, set the diffuse to 1 and the color is neutral grey, and I will just go to the render stats of this character and create a layer override for primary visibility. He's not going to cast shadows, he's not going to be primarily visible, we just want the caustics from him. So let's take a render. Okay, that's quite bright. We probably have too much caustics going on. If we have a look in the render pass, you can see there are quite a lot of caustics there. Well, they do look quite nice. We can play with the intensity in post, so I think that looks pretty good. We can always increase the amount of photons to get sharper caustics, although it does take a lot longer to render. So I think I'm not sure what number this is, it's probably 1 million at the moment. It's actually 10 million photons, I think. It's very hard to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yes, 10 million photons. That should do us. And now we'll need to split up the render layers for compositing 2D elements inside of Maya. So let's do that now. So we have the caustics layer. Let's isolate just the man himself. We want to have motion blur in this scene, and as you know, it's pretty much impossible to correctly matte motion blurred elements unless they're isolated already. So we need to isolate the man. So I'll copy the master layer and call this man. And on this layer, nothing else will be visible. It will just be the man. So turn off primary visibility for the projection. And I believe it's already off for, oh no, it's not. Turn that off there for the chessboard. And we want to make sure that we don't have an image plane. It's already set to 0 alpha, and we disabled the primary visibility of our image-based lighting, so that should be good. So let's see what we get. Now this is taking a long time to render. That's because of the caustics. I'm just trying to interrupt it there with escape. We can actually hide the spotlight on this particular layer. This layer, we do not need caustics. And that should render quite a bit faster. Okay, that looks nice. Just make sure the alpha is also good, which it is. Good. So we have the man isolated. Now I might just want a matte because we don't actually get solid alpha for this. So let's just copy this layer and call this matte. And basically, if we just go to the hypershade and add in a surface shader and just set this to white, we will have a solid alpha here, and on this render layer we'll turn off ray tracing because we don't need it. Cool, that's good. We have our matte layer. Okay, now let's create our shadow layer by copying the master layer, call this shadow, and what we want to do with this layer is remove the chessboard. We only want the shadow catcher, and we want the man, but we don't want him visible. We just want him there casting shadows on the scene. Now let's go into the render settings. What we need to do is create a shadow render pass so that we can isolate the shadow and be able to have lots of control over the look of it inside of compositing. So let's associate the shadow, and we don't need the indirect pass on this layer. Let's also go into the features and turn off caustics and final gather, because we need neither of those and they will just make the render take longer. So let's render this and see what we get. Also, if you have caustics turned on, you won't get these nice colors in your shadow, so keep that in mind. Now let's take a look at our render pass, and this is what we get. Shadows down there, that's exactly what we want. But there is a slight problem, and the problem is that if we have a look in our hypershade and in our projector, this projection node is actually slightly inaccurate, and the method that we're going to be using to composite the shadow render layer requires 100% accuracy, so this projection node isn't going to work for us. So what we need to do is swap this out for the camera map node, which is actually hidden by default inside of Maya. So what you'll need to do, if you haven't exposed the mental images production shaders, is just type this into your Mel window. I'll just put this up, so pause the video, write this down, and then type it into Mel. Once you've done that, hit enter and restart Maya, and that will give you access to the mental images production shaders. And we're going to be using the MIP camera map, which is just a better way to project textures from the camera. So I'll delete this projection node here, and what we want to do is drag this. We don't want to drag it into the map. If we do that, you'll notice it's taking the file3.message to the camera map. We don't want that. We want to go other, and we want to take the out color to the map, not the message. You'll get problems if you don't do it this way. So that's good, and in the projector, let's link this back up, and then let's just compare the old image that we rendered and re-render. And you'll see a slight difference. It's pretty much impossible to tell which one is right, but I can just tell you right now that the MIP camera map is correct, and this slightly different normal camera projection node is incorrect, and you can see the difference there. Okay, so now with the correct method of projecting our texture, the shadow layer is good to go. Now let's set up render passes for the other layers. We have the shadow on the shadow layer. We have indirect to get the caustics, which is correct. In the man, we will want to have object normal in camera and world space, and these will let us refract any images or 2D cards or 2D elements behind this object, because the normals tell you which way the geometry is facing. We can use that as a map to refract. So let's associate those. Actually, no, let's continue adding more. Let's add in a reflection, and refraction and specular. That should be all the ones we need for this guy. And the reason I'm just doing a normal camera and a normal world as well is because I just like to compare which one looks better inside of compositing as opposed to just being limited to one. Okay, so that's the man setup. The matte obviously doesn't need any render passes, so that's that setup. Now let's, we don't need to render the master layer, so turn that off. That won't render anymore, which is good. But one thing I want to do is turn on motion blur, and I'm going to do that on the master layer. So let's go to quality and crank the quality up to 2, set it to Gauss if it's not already, and turn motion blur to full. Now we don't actually need that on the shadow, so I'm just going to create a layer override and turn it off just so it renders quicker. We really won't notice. And on the caustics I will also turn off motion blur, and if we haven't done so already, turn off final gather on the caustics, because that will actually muddy up our caustics. We want our caustics just on their own, and if you have final gather, that's another form of indirect lighting, so they'll both be chucked into the same render pass. So you just want, you don't want any final gather on your caustics layer. And on the man, of course, we want motion blur because he's our matte. Sorry, he's not our matte, but he's the glass man. We want motion blur on him. And the matte, those are the only two that we need motion blur on. And apart from that, we'll just set up, let's just set up our naming convention. Currently, this is putting it in the images folder, creating a new folder based on the render layer, which is nice, but it's calling it the scene name, which is not nice. So if we insert the layer name, it'll label it as the render layer that it is. But we also want to include a folder. We don't want all these render layers just chucked in here. There'll be hundreds and hundreds of images. So I'll put a slash to make a folder, and then another render layer token. So inside of images folder, we'll have a folder that is titled the render layer, and then the name of the render layer .exr, and we want zip compression for compositing inside of Nuke. We want name.number.extension, and we want to render from 0 to 167. We want to render from render cam, and I'm going to change the resolution. It was 960 by 1103. That's the undistorted version of 1080, but I'm just going to change it to 1320 by 742, and that is just to sort of downscale it to 720p, because otherwise the project files will be too big to send to you guys. So with that done, I'll just turn off the default light. It's already off, great. And that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and render that, and I hope to see you guys in the AEtuts tutorial, the next part of this series, compositing all these render passes and 2D elements inside of Nuke.